Welcome back to the Bean Museum, everybody. Thank you for tuning in on our Facebook page to Life Science Live. This is our little program where we like to talk about life science topics live with you guys right now. So just remember, if you have any questions throughout this program, you're welcome to comment them down below, and I'll try and answer them here live in the video. Or if you are watching this video later, you can still comment and we'll go back and answer as many questions as we can, all right? Okie dokie, so today we are talking about amphibians. Now there are three kinds of amphibians. You probably are pretty familiar with two of them, and then the third one you may have never heard of. So good job if you've heard of this one, but we have three kinds. We have frogs, salamanders, and caecilians. Now the first two, you may have also heard them termed as frogs or toads, salamanders or newts, anything like that. Those are all in those same groups. And then we have caecilians, which look a lot like snakes or worms, some people compare them to, but they aren't reptiles or invertebrates like snakes or worms. They are amphibians. So they have all the same qualities that we're going to talk about in amphibians in the next little bit here. Now, first things first, the word amphibian comes from the Greek word amphibios, which means double life. Now, they get that name because they go through metamorphosis. Now, a couple weeks ago, we talked about metamorphosis in moths and butterflies, and it is similar here with amphibians, but a little bit different. So they start out similar to the ones that we talked about before, moths and butterflies. They start out as an egg, and then they hatch into their larval stage, which is a tadpole. You've probably seen those before, maybe even gone and caught some. They hatch into a tadpole, but instead of going into like a cocoon and becoming their adult stage after that, they continue to be out and about in the world, in their habitat, throughout the time that they're going through metamorphosis. So let's start with the first stage, the egg. Now when they start out as an egg, we've definitely seen eggs before. You know, you're probably pretty familiar with chicken eggs or other bird eggs. They have that really hard shell on the outside. Well, amphibians have never developed that hard shell. That was something that the birds adapted to have so that they could lay eggs out on land without having to be near water. So amphibians have to lay their eggs in water because they need to stay wet. Instead of having a hard shell on the outside, they have it's called a permeable membrane. It means that the outside of the egg is really, really soft and a lot of water can get in, which is great because they need that water, but it can also really easily get out. Which is a big problem if they get taken out of the water. So amphibians have to lay their eggs in the water. Now I have something cool to show you guys. I have some reptile eggs, and reptiles are different from amphibians. They're a totally different group, similar to how birds are totally different from amphibians or mammals, but they have kind of in-between eggs. So these right here are iguana eggs. And instead of having a hard shell or being forced to lay them in the water, they have kind of a soft outside. They have this leathery outside instead of being a permeable membrane or having a hard shell. So that's just kind of something cool. We've got these iguana eggs here to show you the difference between the three different kinds of eggs that are laid. All right. So next stage, we go from eggs. After they hatch as tadpoles. Now tadpoles, like I said, are the larval stage of amphibians. And all three groups, frogs, salamanders, and caecilians, all go through that larval stage at one point. So they start out in the water and they hatch having gills to breathe, similar to a fish. So they breathe in the water using their gills in their neck to breathe, and they have a tail to swim with. So they are purely aquatic at that point in their life. Well then, as they're going through metamorphosis to become an adult, they grow out of those gills, so the gills disappear and they grow lungs, similar to mammals, same way that we have lungs. So they lose the ability to breathe underwater, but they gain the ability to breathe on land. So that's a big one. They also gain legs. So if we look at the three different groups, they have a couple of differences between the adults. So frogs, for example, gain legs and lose their tail as a tadpole. Salamanders gain legs and grow a different kind of tail. I'm actually right here next to our freshwater exhibit, and you can see our little model of a tiger salamander. Ooh, if I don't cover it up. Our little model of a tiger salamander right back here. So he's got legs and a tail. And then we have the third group, caecilians. And that third group does not grow legs, but they do grow lungs like the other two. So like I said, they kind of look like snakes in the sense that they have no legs and that they're really long, but they're not snakes. They are amphibians like these other ones. Now, the tadpoles and the eggs have to live in water because they have to stay moist. The eggs do, or with the tadpoles, they have to be able to breathe using their gills. Once they reach adulthood, they no longer have to stay in the water 24/7, but they still need to stay moist. So their skin needs to stay wet for a couple of reasons that we'll get into. First things first, though, we're going to talk about adults a little bit more. So the adult forms of these different animals, like I said, they have lungs to help them breathe, but they've also adapted a few other things as well. So for example, instead of just having lungs, they can also breathe through their skin. So that's one of the reasons their skin needs to stay moist, is because they breathe and drink water through their skin. Now, we can't do that. I wish we could. That'd be super cool, just to be able to sit there and just like breathe through your skin, or drink water through your skin. But our skin works a little differently. We have pores in our skin that produce oil. And those oils help to keep our skin soft and very flexible. So those pores are really important. They also help to grow hair. So anywhere that you have hair on your body, it's coming out of a pore. Now, amphibians also have pores, but instead of growing hair or producing oil, instead they breathe and drink water, like I said. Now, one of the reasons they have to breathe through their skin, which is kind of unusual, especially since they have lungs, they already have one form of breathing, they don't really need a second form, right? Well, amphibians have adapted, especially frogs have adapted, different rib cages than the kind that we are used to. So our rib cage extends all the way from the top of the rib cage to the bottom of the rib cage. And at the bottom of the rib cage, we have a muscle that helps us to breathe called the diaphragm. And the diaphragm works by pulling down, it flexes, and that sucks air into our lungs. Now, that's a really helpful, forceful way of breathing. We're able to really create a vacuum and pull air into our lungs. Well, amphibians don't have that bottom part of their rib cage, nor do they have the diaphragm, that muscle that pulls air into the lungs. The reason for this is partly because, especially frogs, think about the way that they move around. They hop a lot of different places, right? That's how they locomote. So if they're hopping around, every time that they hit the ground after a hop, they jump, they land, that landing is going to hit their stomach really, really hard. So if they have ribs there, every single time that they hit, it puts them at risk of breaking those ribs. So they still have some ribs that extend into their back and that are a little higher up in their chest, but they don't have those lower ribs, those same bones in the bottom of their rib cage. So when they hit against the ground every time that they hop, instead of the possibility of snapping their ribs, instead it just kind of is all squishy right there. It's got lots of muscle and fat and organs, and it just all kind of goes blah, blah, blah. So that's how they survive without a rib cage. But without a rib cage, it means you don't have a diaphragm. And if you don't have a diaphragm, it makes it a lot harder to breathe. If you've ever taken a look at a frog or a salamander before, you might be able to see them breathing, and you might have thought this was something else, but you can see their throat kind of going kind of up and down like this. So they breathe just by moving the muscle in their mouth and their lower jaw. They just kind of extend it, and that creates a small vacuum that pulls air into their mouth and kind of into their lungs, but it's not as effective as if they had a muscle built for that purpose, which is why they also breathe through their skin. Now, something that's kind of cool about them being able to breathe through their skin is that we can use amphibians as what's called an indicator species. Now, indicator species are animals that are very sensitive to their environment. So you can imagine if they're taking in air and water constantly through their skin, this isn't an active process. This is something that they just kind of absorb constantly through their body. If they're doing that, if there was pollutants in the water, if there's gross, nasty things in the water that is not healthy for those animals, we'll know really quickly. If we see a sudden drop in populations of amphibians, then that can be an early indicator that that environment could be in trouble. So a lot of biologists use that as an indicator to know when it's time to be looking closely at an environment and when it's time to, if it's healthy or not. You can tell by the number of amphibians that are able to live there. All right, now here at the museum, we have a lot of different specimens that we love to have here. I'm going to actually tilt you a little bit so you can see like our otter a little bit better. So we have some taxidermy animals where we have the fur is preserved and put onto a mount so you can see the animals like this, or similar with our reptiles. Their scales are easy to preserve, or their shells like this turtle here. But our little amphibious friend right here, he is just a model. He's not actually taxidermied in any way because it's a lot harder to taxidermy and to preserve amphibians. So I actually brought along a couple of examples of how we preserve amphibians here in the museum, and how we preserve a lot of different animals back behind the scenes. So here's a little look behind the scenes here at the Bean Museum. Now this right here is our little jar. It's got a toad in it. So I'm going to bring it up close so you can see. You can see his legs. There's his head right there. So we keep things in jars like this with labels on them, and it makes it a lot easier to go back and study. So one of the reasons that we have a museum like this is for people to come and enjoy our different specimens and to learn about wildlife and things, but it's also a way to collect different animals so that scientists can look at them and study them. And so if we want them to be able to study it, you know, they can't just look at a model and say like, oh yeah, that's what all salamanders look like. You know, they want to be able to look at each individual salamander, each individual specimen, especially if they want to look at DNA. So this preserves the DNA in different ways so you can better study these specific animals. So this is how we store some of our fish and amphibians and reptiles. We store them in jars like this behind the scenes. So it's kind of a cool little peek of what the museum is like in the back. All right, now, one last fun little thing that we're going to talk about. This little tiger salamander here that I've been displaying, this cute little yellow guy right there, he is native here to Utah. So if you go around to different wetlands in Utah, you might be able to see a tiger salamander. They like to burrow down into the mud, so it might be a little bit harder to see them, but these guys do live around here. Like I said, they live in wetlands, but 70% of Utah is actually desert, and the tiger salamanders live there as well as a couple other kinds of amphibians. Now, if we're recalling back to what I said before about, amphibians need to stay moist. They need to stay wet. Are deserts usually very moist? Not generally, no. They're pretty dry. It's pretty much what defines a desert, actually, is the fact that it's very dry. So the amphibians that live in the desert have actually adapted in certain ways to make it easier for them to live there. So, for example, there are tiger salamanders that live in the deserts of Utah that have found permanent water sources. So they're areas that stay wet all year round. And because it's not as beneficial for them to come out on land where they would dry up really, really quickly because of how dry the air is, there are some that stay what's called neotonic. And that means that they never come out of that larval stage. So they go from egg to tadpole, and then they stay a tadpole. And they even reproduce as a tadpole and lay eggs in that form. And that's beneficial to them because they've found a permanent water source. They don't need to come out on land where they'll dry up really easily. So that's just one adaptation that certain tiger salamanders have had in desert homes. Now, there are also lots of frogs and toads that live in the desert. And those guys, they don't usually have the same development as the tiger salamanders do, where they sometimes just stay neotonic, where they stay in their tadpole larval stage. Instead, as a frog, they usually burrow down into the dirt for up to 9 months. And they wait until it's the rainy season again. So they'll burrow down into the dirt and they'll stay down there and they cover themselves in mucus. And the mucus helps to encapsulate them. It holds them in all of their water. All right, so they don't need to drink more water. They've adapted to not need to produce as much waste while they're in that state. So they just stay there for 9 months. Then finally, when the rainy season comes, they come out of their burrows into the temporary ponds or slow-moving rivers that can appear during those rainy times, and they lay their eggs really, really quickly. So they lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch and turn into tadpoles, or they're tadpoles and they turn into adults even faster than most other amphibians would. So the average time for a normal amphibian not living in a desert situation to go from hatched tadpole to full adult is about a year. But with those specific desert species, they sometimes can be as quick as 2 weeks going from tadpole to full adult. And then, while it's still nice and wet, they gorge themselves on as many insects and things that they can find. They eat until they're nice and fat, and then they go and burrow for another 9 months. So they use those fat reserves that they get during the rainy season. Pretty cool that even amphibians are able to find a way to live even in the desert, even despite the fact that it's so dry compared to what they're used to. Now I'm going to answer one last common question and maybe a misconception that you may have heard about. I get this question a lot when we talk about amphibians, so I want to make sure that you guys understand it. I'll get the question all the time, what's the difference between a frog and a toad? So this is the question we're going to be closing out with. It's maybe a question that you've had before, but a frog and a toad have no real difference. So if you've heard, oh, well, toads live in drier areas and they're bumpier, anything like that, that's just a generalization. The name frog or the name toad doesn't have any scientific basis. So it doesn't mean anything about their DNA or any specific features that they have. It's just whatever scientists saw it and said, looks like a toad. Or, oh yeah, I think that's a frog. And really, they're just different species under the same umbrella of frog or toad. So, if you've ever wondered whether a frog or a toad, if an animal was a frog or a toad, it all depends on what scientists named it. So, really, it can go either way. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you have an excellent week. Thank you for listening about amphibians. And we look forward to hearing from you throughout the rest of the week. Tune in for some more programs. We'll be having a Discovery reading tomorrow and Thursday, and we'll have another Life Science Live on Friday. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to leave them down below, and we will answer them as quickly as we can. But until then, we'll see you guys later. Bye!